Okay, so let's get started. So again, welcome everyone to this week's Welcome Change. Today we're exploring the power of procurement. Procurement is where the rubber meets the road for institutions looking to align their values and actions and wield their purchasing power for good. I'm Amy with the Ashoka team, and I'm so happy to introduce two Ashoka Fellows who are leaders in procurement innovation. And I'll do that quickly, and then I'm going to actually duck out, and the two of you will be carrying the conversation forward. So first, I'm thrilled to introduce Paula Daniels, joining us from LA. Hi, Paula.
Hi.
Paula, so you're the founder of Center for Good Food Purchasing, where you help procurement teams of public institutions sustainably source food. Your center's signature program is active in 21 regions in the US, so welcome again. Turning now to Berlin, Sascha Haselmayer, you're joining us from Berlin. Hi, Sascha.
Hi. Good evening.
Yes, and you're the founder of Citymart, a pioneer in city innovations, and you're also a fellow at New America Foundation. You work with cities and city mayors and their teams, and I love that you say that every procurement is an opportunity. So a few housekeeping bits before I duck out. This conversation will run for about 30 minutes, and we love hearing everybody's questions, so feel free to drop them into the Q&A as we're moving along. You can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as we have time. If you prefer to use closed captions, you can just go to more, also at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and signal show subtitles. So feel free to do that. And we'll also be dropping in a few links into the chat to everybody's websites, to new reports coming out, which you'll learn more about. So you can keep an eye on the chat as we move along. So we're excited for this conversation. And with that, Paula, I'm going to pass to you to get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. And thank you so much to the Ashoka team for putting this together. I've always been so appreciative of being an Ashoka Fellow. And part of the benefits are I get to meet people like Sascha Haselmayer, which I was connected with Sascha when I first became an Ashoka Fellow for the work I did with our organization, of which I'm a co-founder, along with my co-founder Alexa Delwich, co-founder of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. So Sascha's work in procurement has been something I've admired for quite some time. And we are here today to embrace that word procurement, because we could instead say purchasing power, the buying power of institutions. But procurement kind of sums it up in a way, because it does sort of, it kind of has in it the essence of the wonkiness of the term and the fact that it is a bureaucratic process for the most part. The bureaucracy around procurement is something Sascha and I have been working with, understanding that those rules around procurement originally arose out of a need for fairness, out of a sense of wanting to serve the public interest in avoiding backroom deals and avoiding nepotism. So it became an open process that had a lot of rules. And some of the rules involved low cost, which were in order to, manage public money carefully. But over time, do those rules really incorporate public values, particularly as they evolve? And do they do it in a fair way? And so this is the work that Sascha and I do. So for the next 20 minutes, we'll be touching on that procurement, on what it is, why we should care about it, and how it can be transformative, the power of procurement. So for our first question, I'm going to turn over to Sascha to pose our first question to us.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. So procurement, most people that are somewhat in the know will rarely talk about procurement as being delightful or fun. So you and I set out to find a fun fact about procurement each. And I couldn't do just a fun fact. I had to do like an important, but maybe not fun fact, which is that city and local governments this year in 2021 are going to spend $6.4 trillion in procurement. And why this fact is important is that city and local governments are not in the business of national defense or national industrial policy. So all of that money is destined to the common good. And I think that's what excited me about procurement, that we could do something much more creative with that funding. But I have a kind of fun fact in this kind of nerdy space to complement this, which is that despite procurement also resonating these bureaucratic and nerdy tones. Actually, ordinary people can take part, and in fact should take part at every single step of the procurement process. There's no step in procurement that ordinary people cannot and shouldn't be part of. And I think that can result in fun, and we may get to that later. So over to you, Paula, what's the fun fact that you brought to this conversation?
Okay, well, this will speak to how wonky I am, because the fun fact I have is around money as well, since we're talking about purchasing power. So US information, the US spends 1.1 trillion on food alone. You mentioned 6.4 trillion in spending by, but just on food alone. Of that, 120 billion is from large institutions like schools, hospitals, universities, and so forth, food service institutions. Of that, 13 billion is in the US school food program, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. And of that, our organization, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, is analyzing about $1 billion worth of purchasing from schools, hospitals, correctional facilities, recreation and parks departments, entertainment venues, municipal entities from around the country. And what we are seeing, so here's the fun part of the fact, is that many of them are working toward increasing the amount of local purchasing so they can support local economies, environmentally sustainable purchasing, protecting animal welfare, fair labor practices, and nutritional health, and they're all working in that direction. So to me, that's a fun fact that we have a chance to work together in that regard. So my question now for both of us is, why should we care about it, and what does it matter? And is there a favorite quote along those lines? So for me, I want to mention a recent report that came out last week from the Rockefeller Foundation called The True Cost of Food, Measuring What Matters to Transform the US Food System. So they analyzed not only that number, that 1.1 trillion in spending on food in the United States, but also what were some of the externalized impacts? What are the impacts that aren't in the cost itself of the food product? And from that, they found that of the spend, the 1.1 trillion, 3 trillion, 3 times as much are externalized impacts, like negative impacts to health, the economies, and the environment. So the negative impacts on health were about 1.1 trillion. On greenhouse gas emissions and ecological impacts, it was 900 billion, and about 100 billion in livelihood impacts. So that leads me to my favorite quote from Oliver De Schutter, who was the special rapporteur on the right to food at the United Nations. And it was from his paper, The Power of Procurement, Public Purchasing. Here it is. Governments have few sources of leverage over increasingly globalized food systems, but public procurement is one of them. When sourcing food for hospitals, schools, and public administrations, governments have a rare opportunity to support more nutritious diets and more sustainable food systems in one fell swoop. Over to you, Sascha.
Yeah, so this reminds me of a shocking fact that I read recently in Carlo Petrini's book, The Founder of Slow Food, and he wrote about that in Italy, I think the year he reported on was 2010. Every year, about 400,000 illegal migrants are used to do the harvests under near slavery conditions, and I think what you're talking about, the fact that food is not just good, but that it needs to be clean, that it needs to be fair, that there's so many externalities to it. And we haven't even added up those numbers yet. As I've been thinking about a favorite quote about food, procurement to me always relates to bureaucracy. I cannot, working with government procurement, you just can't help putting those two things together. So I want to quote James Wolfensohn, who was the president of the World Bank. And in 1995, he kicked off a really, really big reform for the World Bank, this huge global aid organization, in effect. And he said that I have learned that the real test of development can be measured not by the bureaucratic approval, but by the smile on a child's face when a project is successful. And I think it's incredibly important in something that seems so nerdy and bureaucratic as procurement, that we retain that kind of razor sharp focus on outcomes, that the process of procurement only is there to give us outcomes and to generate positive impact. And to me, that was just so inspiring. And actually, he kicked off really interesting reforms, for example, mandating that all senior staff at the World Bank had to spend time living in a slum community to actually begin to build empathy and firsthand experience of the community they were serving, and kind of turn the organization away from being this kind of elitist administrative organization of bureaucratic process in a way. I think we're moving on a little bit to why should we care, right? And I think we talked about this, as everyone thinks of it as bureaucratic. No one really knows how it works. A lot of professionals actually told me that they'd rather not have anyone know what procurement is, that it's like should be administered by these secretive experts that do a great job, and then we just benefit from their work. So Paula, when I read your organization's report, a roadmap for the post-pandemic food system we need, first of all, it resonated so much. You said 2030, right? And unbeknownst, at around the same time, I was working on a report that tried to set goals for 2030. And I read it and I was just sitting there like, yes, 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 yes. I love this. And part of it, what I really loved about the report is that it talked about the extraordinary work that school districts were doing during the COVID pandemic to serve children and families. And I think it just served as a reminder that government isn't this anonymous bureaucracy that doesn't care and just administers processes, that in particular in many school districts, we have these people with a lot of passion and care and who know exactly their moral and ethical north. And then from that kind of, I love the way that you captured, and what I strongly believe in, the community organizing element. You cannot do good food procurement without community organizing. You cannot do it without actually building a movement around it. And this is just this radical departure from this kind of silent, expert, technocratic understanding of procurement. And there's also a sense in there that we need to invest in procurement, and that we invest in this organizing to kind of sustain this change and kind of maintain this capacity. Another three things that I kind of want to touch on. One is that you talked about we need to have a vision for where we want to go. We need to have a clear sense of mission and priorities that extend beyond each individual transaction. Right, and procurement is incredibly opportunistic. We talk about, I want to buy this, and then we kind of do what we need to get that. But you're talking about expanding the horizon, taking on this full value and full cost of food approach. And the other part that I think is always important to remind ourselves is that we're dealing with public resources, not just the money, but the public health and the resilience in a way of our communities, as COVID showed us. And so openness and transparency need to underpin this journey and the story. And I think there's something to learn for procurement everywhere, not just public procurement, but procurement everywhere. And because it helps us staying optimizing, continuous improvement to get better outcomes. And now I'll close my kind of little resonance here with your report. Imagination. I think a lot of what you're describing is about imagination. And for a long time, I've been thinking that we so much celebrate the kind of disruptive startup world with their crazy ideas, but actually the ideas of transforming the food system in the way you're describing it is really audacious. And is a really audacious goal. And I think what you're showing is how one transaction at a time we're getting to achieve that transition. So over to you, Paula.
Well, Sascha, thank you so much for reading our report so carefully, and I'm so glad it resonated with you. I read yours as well and found it absolutely fascinating. There are quite a few examples in there that maybe we can talk about next. But what really resonated with me was your idea of citizen engagement, that it's the process can be shaped in order to be more inclusive. I will confess that I was in that bureaucracy. So when I was at City Hall, I was commissioner with the Board of Public Works, and in LA, that's a full-time position. And we meet in public hearing and function a lot like city councils function, in which all our decisions are made at a microphone in a publicly noticed hearing. And most of what our work was to award bids through the procurement process. There was a lot of it. So there were a lot of construction projects that we awarded on. We didn't purchase any food, but we did have that process. So I did see the value of how it was structured, in that we had that open hearing process and people could come and participate, but it was after the fact, so as you said, it was folks who were, the folks who were involved in contract administration and otherwise had prepared the bid, had submitted them, they came back, they reported to us what the bids were and how they were making their choice. And then if a citizen, if somebody else cared about it and knew about the hearing, could come and testify, they could. But over time, that structure became a little more difficult, especially when you have a big city and a big distance from where folks live and how city functions. So the ideas that you have resonate. It's in part, as you noticed, how we work. We do have community organizations around the country working with government officials to craft what the procurement processes can be. So that inclusive process is really significant and leads to a lot of the changes that you and I are talking about. So it seems to be at the heart of it. And in your report, which was just a lot of fun to read, you have really great examples, which I'm going to ask you to talk about in a second. But the thing that I really resonated with was how you talked about creating a committee of yes. So creating a reform team so that cities could look at how they're going to transform their procurement processes, and then create a committee that can solve the problem and work with citizens in the community on what's needed up front. So it's not that they're coming in after the fact to sort of protest, in other words. And so it doesn't put them in a protest mode, it puts them in a participatory mode. So maybe I could ask you to talk about that. Do you have some favorite examples? And I'll share one of mine after, if you'll share one of yours.
Yeah. And I just as we jump into the examples, and I realize I flipped the script a little bit, but I kind of, just as a reminder, right? What we describe when we talk about food, and food is such a brilliant example. Procurement really is the engine to transform a number of big and important systems, right? It's incredibly important for our climate resilience. It's incredibly important for our adaptation to social mobility questions, to inclusiveness, to inclusion, to issues of public safety, infrastructure, utilities. So it really is the kind of secret power behind a lot of these big systems. And I think the example I want to give, I want everyone to kind of think about how this in a way resonates with some of the systems you're thinking about or working with when you kind of, that you're passionate about. So another Ashoka Fellow, Darrell Hammond, founded this incredible organization, Kaboom. And Kaboom really is there to help communities build playgrounds. And I think his discovery was that a lot of playgrounds get built and then they don't get used. And they developed this fabulous playbook in which playgrounds are, as a matter of principle, designed by children. And the process of designing this is supported by parents and teachers and facilitators, but it starts with the children coming together and dreaming big. It also connects to city governments and other institutions by finding the most prominent pieces of land to place these playgrounds. Usually in the past, they were placed in the worst, like forgotten pieces. This was about prominence. And so this process has a kind of really amazing, almost like a dance between the city government and its procurement process and the community. And what happens is that the grown-ups begin to collaborate in the design of the process and the planning. The government actually procures, let's say, the groundworks, laying the foundations or moving kind of the things off the land. But then the whole thing culminates in a big event where the government procures, so to speak, the elements, the bits and pieces of the playground. And the community, hundreds of volunteers come together over a weekend to build it and celebrate it. And what happens as a result, you get much better designs that actually are really, really adapted to the needs of the community. You get this incredible ownership in the community of this infrastructure, right? They build it, they own it, they designed it, they will use it. And every hour a child plays is an hour won for society. And it comes in at lower cost, right? And they actually expanded that model to really multi-million-dollar recreational facilities. And it always is this kind of connection. I think the vision here for me that resonates is that procurement is involving the community every step of the way. It's very, very close. And it leverages everything the community can give, but also then is a really, really solid and transparent government process, right? It doesn't, those things are not mutually exclusive. And, you know, we can see how that kind of can be applied to any number of other things. So that was my example, Paula.
Yeah, that's great. And you know what? That's a really great one. There's another one in your report at page 20 on how Sydney's procurement team became a champion for Indigenous reconciliation. So I recommend that folks read that. It's about making sure that Indigenous businesses were able to participate in government contracting. So it requires some outreach along those lines. So I have an example like that in school food. So I have two examples in school food. One is in Minneapolis, and it's the Minneapolis Public Schools is led by a really visionary food service director, and he has established a farm to school coordination office. And there's a woman named Kate Siebold who runs their farm to school program. And she's shifted the procurement from what used to be just the schools who had their menus and they would say, now here's what we want, who can bid to this? And then we want it in 2 weeks. That was sort of the, I'm simplifying it, but that was kind of the old process. And farmers would already have had their crops growing by that period of time. So it tends to, that method tended to support an existing global on-demand economy. But if you want to support local farmers, what you could do what Minneapolis Public Schools did, and they work with their team for their menu ahead of time. They have meetings with the farmers in advance and say, this is what we're likely to order. And they plan with them in advance of their growing season so that they can go ahead and grow according to the menu. And with that arrangement with Minneapolis Public Schools, they have some certainty about where their food products will go and that it will go to the school system. So that's a way to be inclusive of the smaller local farmers. And it takes that kind of planning, a little bit more planning. Another favorite example I have is the Urban School Food Alliance. It's the alliance of the largest several school districts now, about a dozen or so in the United States. And when they first organized some years ago, they wanted to get serving trays in their school districts that weren't styrofoam. So they wanted to incorporate environmental goals, right, in their purchasing. And so they collectively went to the tray manufacturer and said, we don't want styrofoam trays anymore. Can you manufacture something else? Collectively, we purchase X billion dollars worth, or whatever the number was, of trays. We want something compostable. So they now have compostable trays. So they were able to make that environmental change, as well as to make a change on chicken. So they collectively said, we do not want to purchase chicken that's been raised with antibiotics. We want chicken that's raised without the routine use of antibiotic. So that's the change they made as well. So that collective purchasing power across institutions as well, when they put their minds to it, can flow through the procurement process and make real changes in the whole landscape. Those are my favorite two stories.
Yeah, no, and I think it's there is I kind of came across a bunch of international examples on food and local community food, and I see here that we have this question from Sarah about how unions and cooperatives can try to obtain money through the procurement system and whether they do this already. And maybe we kind of kick off with food, and then I can maybe add something to it.
Well, I think that in our program, the Good Food Purchasing Program, we award points. So we take the information of the school districts and how they're purchasing, and we will rate it. We'll basically give them a feedback tool and rate it and reflect to them how their purchasing is. And they get more points if they source from a union facility. So that is a way that it is incorporated because they're able to see how that's helpful, from a fair labor standpoint. But there's also in other areas, not just in food, there's definitely project labor agreements for construction. There's lots of other benefits that can be woven into bid awards on those larger scale contracts.
Yeah, I would maybe add that, sometimes, cooperatives are often large and significant providers of food and many other goods and services to cities. And I think there are kind of two techniques here. In some cases, local governments are breaking up big contracts. So to stay with the food analogy, to buy small amounts from local farmers because they can't meet the whole need of the system. And in some cases, those farmers will be organized as cooperatives. In other cases, the government will effectively manage them like a cooperative, right? They will kind of get the bits and pieces for everyone to kind of meet their needs. And to give you an idea, in Bogota, in Colombia, the city had, I think, 4 providers for food, and then realized that their contracting was designed in a way that no one could really and wanted really to participate. And then overnight, in a way, when they recontracted it, when they used procurement differently, they had 52 vendors, and many of them were smaller and local ones. So I think it's procurement is one of those things where you can, without intention, create huge obstacles or become a really big enabler of these kind of union or cooperative systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. That's a good example. That it depends on how they structure it and how they focus their intentions in the process. So is it going to be some efficient movement of paper, or are they going to put more time into outreach? And procurement professionals, as you pointed out, hadn't been trained that way originally. But once they see what the impacts are of what they do and what they can do, they become more empowered themselves, right? And we also do see, just in our food sourcing, that we do give points for cooperative purchasing. So if they're able to, like the example in Minneapolis public schools, to form relationships with the growing community when they're buying food, then they'll know what the farm ownership type is more. So it takes that relationship building over time and that intentionality around how your procurement's going to serve the community and structuring it that way.
I see this other question coming in from Jordi about, I'll read this out. Do you know of examples connecting the more technological approach of innovative public procurement with your examples of community city procurement? And I would say, from my experience, absolutely yes. So I think we did a huge desktop review of published reports and so forth. And I think what we learned was that, first of all, everyone who kind of knows procurement wants procurement to be staffed by creative people who can think critically and understand both community engagement and sustainability. Technology in and of itself is a subset in some forms, but you can use innovative procurement for social care services, and there are wonderful examples. The Impacta Salud program in Chile ran a kind of procurement process for primary healthcare access designed around human relationships, but running it almost like a startup competition and using an agile and iterative approach. So the principles apply everywhere. The best practices in procurement will hold in technology, in innovation, and in very slow moving community pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paula.
What I was going to add here is I just really recommend your report. I know I already have, but you have a good breakdown of action areas that each city can take in terms of making those shifts, looking at their mission and purpose, looking at how they do citizen engagement, looking at these goals of sustainability and equity, looking at the supplier ecosystem, what their own culture is, and staffing, performance and accountability, and that piece of information, data, and technology. You have it laid out in strategic measures. So it's a really good resource for folks who are thinking about it to see what those steps are and what they can communicate to the procurement departments around. So Simon has a question. If I wasn't focused on food, what other procurement areas would I focus on? Oh, that's a juicy question. Yeah, I am now focused on food, but I did also look at purchasing other materials. A lot of cities have environmentally preferable purchasing goals. So all the supplies that cities buy, building materials, there's lots of things that they purchase that make a significant impact on the environment. What about you, Sascha? What do you think are the juicy areas?
Well, I haven't focused on any areas, but I think food is incredibly powerful. I think their social care is very, very exciting. And just to give you a sense, this, you know, we've talked about quotes about procurement, but I can tell you very briefly about my favorite procurement that I've ever seen. And so this was a procurement published by Knowsley City Council in the UK a couple of years ago. And it introduced a 14-year-old disabled girl. That was basically the entire procurement was the text, the contract text was written about this girl. And it was written in a language that honestly almost made me cry. It was like a mother describing her child and the needs. And it was literally a procurement that talked about they were looking for a caregiver to help this 14-year-old girl smile more. You know, they wanted someone to look after her, but there were no KPIs, there were no complex contract languages. This was like, we're looking for a person who will spend a lot of time with her while mother is working and supporting the family and the girl. Here's what she loves. She loves to play, she loves excursions, she loves animals, she loves pottery. And we're looking for a person who is passionate about her. And I think to me, this was just so poetic, and in many ways, I just want more of that. So I guess that's my answer.
And what a good closing thought, actually. I think we're at time. And it's been really wonderful to talk with you, Sascha, and to hear the stories. It's, you know, the ones you mentioned, as well as those illustrated in your report. So any final thoughts from you on the power of procurement?
Oh man, I mean, don't be afraid, right? I think that's the one thing. The law is not complicated. You can always ask tons of questions, but imagine it's like every little thing procurement does affects the lives of so many people involved in receiving the services and producing the services. So it's definitely worth your while. And if you're creative, critically thinking, smart and passionate, you should also consider a career in procurement, because we need to attract people like you.
That's really well put. And I think it's really true that, as Sascha points out so well, there is a lot of power in procurement. It really contributes significantly to the movement of goods, the economy, and the well-being of residents in the community. And there's great opportunity to empower those procurement professionals by participating. So those are my 3 Ps: power, participation in procurement. Thank you so much for this conversation, Sascha. I really always appreciate connecting with you, and it was fun to discuss these issues.
Thank you, Paula. It was wonderful to see you, as always.
Till the next time.
Till the next time. Bye.
Bye.